Life on the farm was supposed to be simple, but for Carol, it had become anything but. She and Joe had spent their lives on the expansive farmland they called home in the heart of Kansas. Their property stretched as far as the eye could see, with fields of golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze. A bright red barn stood proudly in the distance, while their charming farmhouse exuded warmth and character, a testament to decades of love and labor. At 68, Joe rose before dawn each day, slipping into his well-worn work boots to tend to the animals and check on the crops. Farming was in his blood, and his calloused hands bore witness to a lifetime of hard work. Carol, now 65, had devoted herself to supporting Joe in every way she could. She managed the household, crafted hearty meals, and nurtured a garden that was the envy of their neighbors. Yet, over the years, Carol began to feel the weight of their quiet life. The once lively house that echoed with the laughter of their 3 children was now eerily silent. All had moved to distant cities, pursuing careers and raising families of their own. Their visits became infrequent, and phone calls often felt rushed. Carol yearned for the noise, the chaos, and the sense of being needed that had defined her earlier years. She loved Joe, but their conversations had dwindled to discussions about the farm and what was for dinner. He was a good man, steady and reliable, but somewhere along the way, the spark they once shared had faded. One sunny afternoon, Carol found herself in the garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds she had planted years ago. The roses bloomed vibrantly, their reds and pinks a stark contrast to the growing emptiness she felt inside. As she paused to wipe her brow, she gazed across the fields and spotted Joe, his figure barely discernible against the horizon. He looked small and distant. Carol sighed deeply, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Is this it?" she wondered. "Is this all there is for me now?" In her younger years, Carol had dreamed of exploring the world beyond Kansas, the romance of Paris in the spring or the awe of the Grand Canyon. But those dreams faded under the weight of family responsibilities and farm life. Now, with the children gone and everything running like clockwork, nothing remained to distract her from the emptiness enveloping her. Just then, she noticed a truck pulling up to the dilapidated farmhouse next door. The property had sat empty for years, the once pristine barn now weathered and sagging. Curiosity piqued. Carol watched from her kitchen window as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the truck, bringing a glimmer of unexpected hope to her quiet world. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans that bore the signs of hard work, much like the ones Joe wore. He paused to survey the property with a thoughtful expression before heading inside. That evening, Joe settled into his favorite armchair, the flicker of the lamp illuminating the local paper in his hands. Carol, busy in the kitchen, mentioned their new neighbor. "Looks like someone finally bought the Jenkins place," she said, setting down a plate of roast chicken and potatoes. Joe grunted in response, barely glancing up. "About time, that place was falling apart. Maybe we should stop by and introduce ourselves." Joe shrugged. "If he needs anything, he'll come to us." Carol frowned but chose not to argue. A few days later, she decided to take the initiative. Carrying a basket of freshly picked tomatoes from her garden, she walked over to the neighbor's property, where the man was outside, hammering nails into a sagging fence. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a friendly smile. "Afternoon," he greeted, setting down his hammer. Carol held out the basket. "I thought I'd bring some tomatoes over. Welcome to the neighborhood." He wiped his hands on a rag before taking the basket. "That's very kind of you. I'm Tom, by the way." "I'm Carol," she responded. "And my husband Joe and I live just over there." Tom nodded, glancing toward her house. "It's nice to finally have neighbors. This place has been too quiet for too long." Their conversation flowed easily, mostly small talk about their lives. Tom shared that he was a retired carpenter who had moved to the area for a change of pace. Carol found herself smiling more than she had in recent weeks, enjoying the connection they were forming. As she walked back home, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. Tom had returned to his work hammering away at the fence, and she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. In the following weeks, Carol noticed how her walks often coincided with Tom's outdoor projects. Sometimes they exchanged quick waves, other times they lingered to chat. Joe, indifferent to their budding friendship, dismissed Tom as just another neighbor. One evening, as Carol lay in bed listening to Joe snore, she found her thoughts drifting back to Tom, his laughter, his stories about his late wife, and the joy he seemed to find in their conversations. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a sense of being seen and understood. As sleep began to take her, images of Tom's easy smile filled her mind, and she sensed that her quiet life on the farm was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. What had started as a simple gesture of kindness was evolving into something more profound. In the weeks that followed their first meeting, she found herself looking forward to seeing Tom. He was always busy with projects or tending to a newly planted vegetable garden. One afternoon, while returning from the market, she spotted Tom struggling to carry a stack of lumber into his barn. Without thinking, she called out, "Need help?" He looked up with a chuckle. "I wouldn't say no." Carol set her bags down and joined him, helping to carry the heavy planks inside. The barn smelled of sawdust and freshly cut wood, a refreshing change from hers. "Are you building something?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Tom grinned, his eyes lighting up. "A porch swing. I've always wanted one, and now I've got the time to make it happen." "You're so handy," she remarked, feeling a pang of envy at how easily he found focus in his projects. "Can't stay away from building things," he replied, gesturing to his tools. "It keeps my hands busy." As they worked side by side, Carol felt a connection continue to grow, one that hinted at possibilities she had never dared to consider. "I've always wanted a porch swing, and now that I've got the time, I figured I'd make it happen." "You're so handy, Carol." "Yeah, I used to be a carpenter before I retired." "Tom, you never could stay away from building things, could you?" "Keeps my hands busy." "Carol, you must be envious of how easily Tom seems to find joy in his projects." A few days later, Tom stopped by the farmhouse with a surprise. "You might like this," he said, holding up a small wooden birdhouse crafted from some scraps he had lying around. "Carol, take a look at this birdhouse. It's simple, but beautifully made." Carol took the birdhouse, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It was the kind of piece she might have bought at a market stall. "Tom, this is lovely," she said, her voice soft with genuine appreciation. "Well, I thought your garden could use a little more charm," he replied with a sheepish smile. Just then, Joe came in from the fields, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's this?" he asked, glancing at Tom. "Hey, nice one, Tom," Carol exclaimed, impressed. "Nice work, Tom. Thanks, man, I appreciate it," Joe added. Tom stayed for a cup of coffee, chatting easily with Carol and Joe. While Joe seemed content to talk about the weather and crop prices, Carol found herself drawn to Tom's reflections on life, his late wife, and his love for woodworking. For the first time in years, she felt invigorated by a conversation. As the weeks turned into months, Carol and Tom's friendship deepened. They began spending more time together, particularly when Joe was busy working on the farm. Tom showed Carol how to sand and stain wood, even helping her build a small bench for her garden. In turn, Carol shared her knowledge of plants, offering him tips on how to grow tomatoes that would thrive in the Kansas heat. One afternoon, while they sat together in Tom's barn, he turned to her and said, "You know, you're easy to talk to." "Carol, I feel like I've known you forever," he added. Carol felt her cheeks flush. "I could say the same about you." For a brief moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, brief yet undeniable. Back at the farmhouse, Joe remained oblivious to the growing bond between his wife and their neighbor. Routines ruled Joe's life. As long as the farm was running smoothly, he didn't question much. But Carol noticed the differences between the two men. Joe was practical and reserved, while Tom was warm and open. Joe rarely acknowledged the little things anymore, like how she had trimmed the hedges or baked his favorite pie. In contrast, Tom complimented her garden almost every time he saw it. These small moments made Carol feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Tom invited Carol over to see his completed porch swing, which he had just finished staining that morning. He proudly hung it from thick ropes on his porch. Carol settled onto the swing, which creaked gently beneath her weight. "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers along the smooth armrest. Tom sat beside her, and the two of them watched the fields bathed in golden light. "You ever just sit and watch the sunset?" he asked. "Not often," Carol replied, shaking her head. "There's always something to do." Tom glanced at her, his expression serious. "You should take more time for yourself," he suggested. His words lingered, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. For the first time, Carol felt a pang of longing she couldn't quite name. That evening, as she walked back to the farmhouse, her mind raced with thoughts of Tom, an unexpected shift stirring within her. Inside, Joe sat in his armchair, his boots kicked off, eyes glued to the evening news. "Where have you been?" he asked, glancing up briefly. "Just out in the garden," Carol replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Jo nodded and returned to the TV, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life had drifted into uncharted territory. October had arrived, bringing with it cooler air and shorter days. Jo had spent the afternoon fixing the tractor, muttering about a rusted part that slowed him down. By dinner, exhaustion hung heavily on him. "I'm heading to bed," he said, retiring for the night. Carol found herself alone at the kitchen table, the house enveloped in an unsettling silence. The ticking of the old clock seemed amplified, and the hum of the refrigerator cut through her thoughts. She stared at her half-empty teacup, her mind wandering to Tom, pulled by an irresistible force. Before she truly realized it, she was donning her jacket and stepping outside. The familiar path to Tom's house felt daunting, every step echoing her pulsing heart. The porch light illuminated the night, casting a warm glow. Hesitating at the edge of his property, her rational mind urged her to turn back. But before she could, the front door swung open. "Carol!" Tom exclaimed, surprise and warmth intermingling in his voice. "I didn't expect company this late. I couldn't sleep. I just needed some air," she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. Tom smiled, gesturing toward the porch swing. "You're always welcome here. Come on, sit for a while." As they settled onto the swing, rocked gently by their weight, the night enveloped them in tranquility. The rustling of leaves and distant chirps of crickets filled the air, but their silence was rich with unspoken feelings. "Tom, I've been meaning to tell you something," Carol finally ventured, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. He hesitated, his grip tightening on the swing's edge, vulnerability flitting across his features. "I don't want to overstep, but I need to say something," he said, searching her eyes. Carol held her breath, anticipation tying her stomach in knots. "You're remarkable, Carol," he confessed. "I've never met anyone like you. The way you light up when you talk about your garden." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "It's been ages since I felt this way about anyone." Carol felt her chest tighten at his words. "I know you're married, Tom," he continued, regret lacing his tone. "And I don't want to make things harder for you. I can't ignore how I feel," he asserted, and the weight of his confession filled the air between them. Carol reached out and placed her hand over his, a small gesture that felt monumental. "Tom, She started, but the words faltered on her lips. "You don't have to say anything," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "I just needed you to know." The porch light flickered suddenly, jolting them back to reality. Carol quickly withdrew her hand, guilt flooding her cheeks. "I should go," she said, rising from the swing. Tom nodded, his eyes heavy with unspoken longing. "Get home safe, Carol," he called as she walked away, each step a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. As she returned to the farmhouse, a swirl of emotions enveloped her: guilt, excitement, confusion. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but couldn't suppress how alive she felt. In the following days, everything blurred. The routine at home faded, overshadowed by memories of Tom's laughter and their shared glance. Jo noticed her distracted demeanor, attributing it to the changing season. "You feeling okay?" he asked one morning over breakfast. "I'm fine," Carol replied quickly, forcing a smile, even as doubt gnawed at her insides. It wasn't long before she found herself at Tom's house again, this time during a mid-afternoon visit, a batch of freshly baked cookies in hand. "I thought you might like these." She grinned, offering the plate. "You spoil me, Carol," Tom said, his eyes crinkling with delight. They relaxed on the porch, sharing cookies and bridging the gap between everything and nothing, their laughter intertwining with the rustling leaves in a symphony of unshared secrets and burgeoning emotions. In the afternoon, Carol brought over the fresh cookies she had baked that morning. "I thought you might enjoy these," she said, holding the plate out with a warm smile. Tom grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You spoil me, Carol." They settled onto the porch, savoring the cookies as they chatted about life, their conversations drifting from light-hearted banter to deeper, unspoken feelings. As they spoke, the line between friendship and something more began to blur. Tom leaned closer, brushing a crumb from Carol's cheek. The simple gesture sent a shiver down her spine. "I shouldn't be here," she blurted, standing up abruptly. Tom followed her lead, worry etched across his face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Carol's voice trembled as she continued. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Tom stepped closer, his tone soothing. "You're just following your heart, Carol. There's nothing wrong with that, but—" Carol shook her head, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I need to go." She exited quickly, her heart racing as she walked back to the farmhouse. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Joe's soft snores beside her. Trapped between the life she had built with Joe and the undeniable spark with Tom, she felt the heaviness of her choices pressing down on her. "What am I doing?" she whispered into the darkness, knowing she couldn't continue living in this limbo. A decision loomed on the horizon, yet she felt certain that whatever path she chose would irreversibly change her life. Days turned to weeks, and with each encounter with Tom, the weight of her secret grew heavier. Every stolen glance ached with longing, yet guilt shadowed her heart. She hesitated to cross that fragile line, yet each connection she felt seemed like a betrayal to Joe. Blissfully unaware, Joe went about his routines, fixing fences, tending crops, and indulging in old westerns at night. However, Carol noticed subtle changes. He would linger at the kitchen door, his gaze contemplative, and his conversations, once easy, now felt strained. One afternoon, Tom arrived unexpectedly while Carol was kneeling in the garden, planting winter flowers. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. "Tom," she greeted, brushing dirt from her hands. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his expression serious. They settled onto a garden bench, the crisp autumn air rich with the scent of freshly turned earth. "I've been thinking about us," he began, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Carol sighed. "Tom, I don't know what's going on with us. I know, but I care about you, Carol. I probably shouldn't. But I also know this isn't fair to you, your husband, or even to me." Tears pricked at Carol's eyes. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she whispered, regret heavy in her voice. "I understand," Tom replied, his gaze shifting to the horizon, the weight of their situation settling in the silence between them. "We're at a crossroads, Carol. We have to decide what we want and what we're willing to sacrifice." Carol nodded. "You're right," she replied that evening as she prepared dinner. However, she soon noticed that Joe was unusually quiet. He barely touched his plate, repeatedly glancing at her as if he were searching for the right words. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice steady despite her growing concern. Joe looked up, his brow furrowed. "Carol, I've been meaning to ask, have you been spending a lot of time with Tom?" Her breath caught for a moment. "Why do you ask?" she replied cautiously. "I'm not blind, Carol. I've seen the way you talk about him," he said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "The way you—" Her heart raced. "Joe, he sighed heavily. "I'm not angry, I just want to understand. Are you unhappy?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked at her husband, the man she had built a life with, the one who shared her dreams and burdens, and realized she owed him the truth. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been unhappy for a long time." Joe's shoulders slumped, and the silence that followed was deafening. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I didn't think you'd care," Carol admitted. "You've been so wrapped up in the farm and your routines. I felt invisible." Joe's gaze dropped to his hands, his jaw tightening. "Does Tom make you feel like you matter?" Carol hesitated, her silence spoke volumes. Joe stood and walked to the window, staring out at the fields that had been his life's work. After a long pause, he turned back to her. "I need to tell you something. You're not the only one who's been feeling lonely." Carol's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "A few months ago I started meeting someone. Nothing serious, just coffee at the diner, talking about life. But it made me realize how far apart we've grown." "Joe, you said you met someone, right?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Yeah, but I stopped it as soon as I realized what I was doing. I knew it wasn't worth it because you're the one I love." Carol absorbed his words, her mind racing. She realized that she wasn't the only one who had strayed, even if it was in different ways. For the first time in a long time, they had a genuine conversation about their marriage, discussing loneliness, unspoken resentment, and how they had taken each other for granted. "I don't want to lose you, Carol," Joe said, his voice breaking. "But we can't keep going like this." Tears streamed down Carol's face. "I don't want to lose you either, but I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe we start by really trying," Joe suggested. That night, as Carol lay in bed, the weight of everything pressed down on her. She had choices to make about Tom, about Joe, and about the life she wanted moving forward. One thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. Here is the polished text. The days following their heart-to-heart conversation, Carol and Joe's relationship underwent a profound shift. They had grown distant, with Carol caring for the garden and Joe working in the fields, but unspoken tension lingered between them. The revelation that Joe had been emotionally involved with someone else changed Carol's perspective, making her reevaluate her own relationship with Tom. As Carol approached Tom's house, she felt a mix of emotions. Tom was outside, putting up firewood by the barn when he saw her. "Carol, I was just setting down a log," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I wasn't sure. I'd like to talk, Tom. I need to explain something," Carol replied, her voice trembling. They sat on the porch swing, a sanctuary that now felt like a place of reckoning. "I can't keep doing this," Carol began. "Whatever this is, I can't." Tom nodded slowly, looking serious. "I figured you'd say that. I care about you. I need to focus on my marriage. Joe and I have a lot to work through," Carol said. Tom reached over and took her hand gently. "I understand. And I hope you two find your way back to each other." Carol felt a pang of sadness as she stood to leave. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." As she walked away, she glanced back once more. Tom was still sitting on the swing, watching her go. Back at the farmhouse, Carol and Joe started the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. The wounds were still fresh, and the road ahead was uncertain. But Joe surprised Carol by inviting her to sit on the porch with him one evening. He had set out 2 mugs of tea and a plate of her favorite cookies. "It's been a while since we just sat and talked," he said. Carol smiled softly, touched by the gesture. They talked about everything and nothing, memories of their children, stories from their younger days, and even the challenges they were facing now. For the first time in years, it felt like they were truly seeing each other. Joe suggested they see a counselor. "We can't do this alone," he admitted one night. "Not if we want to get back on track." Carol was hesitant at first, but she decided to give it a shot. They started going to a local therapist every week. The sessions were tough, making them face years of resentment and pain they had kept to themselves. But they also found something unexpected, a deep well of love and respect for each other that had been hidden for a long time. Little things started happening between them. Joe started noticing the little things again, like how Carol's hair glowed in the sunlight, or how she always added just the right amount of sugar to his coffee. In turn, Carol started appreciating Joe's quiet strength, the way he worked non-stop to take care of them, and the unspoken love he showed in everything he did. As they worked side by side in the garden one afternoon, Joe paused and looked at her. "You know, I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful for you, Carol, for everything you do." Carol felt tears prick her eyes and she said, "I'm grateful for you, Joe. I always have been." At their counselor's suggestion, Carol and Joe planned a weekend getaway, a chance to reconnect away from the farm. They had a small cabin by a lake, and they spent their days hiking, fishing, and just enjoying each other's company. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Joe took Carol's hand. "Do you remember the first time we danced?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I remember that barn dance," Carol replied, a smile spreading across her face. The weekend getaway was a turning point for Carol and Joe. They returned home feeling more connected than ever before, ready to face the challenges ahead together. "You stepped on my toes at least 5 times. I was nervous," Joe admitted with a chuckle. "You were the most beautiful girl in the room." As Carol gazed at him, her heart swelled. For the first time in years, the flickering firelight reflected in his eyes reignited a warmth she thought she had lost forever. The love they had once shared, felt so vividly as they drove back to the farm that weekend, filled her with hope. Their marriage wasn't perfect, and perhaps it never would be, but they were both willing to work on it. Little did they know, however, that an unexpected visitor would arrive soon, threatening to unravel everything they had fought so hard to rebuild. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. In the kitchen, Carol was busy preparing breakfast, the smell of sizzling bacon wafting through the air. Outside, Joe was checking the barn, wiping his hands on a dish towel. When Carol opened the door, she froze. Tom stood on the porch, looking uneasy with his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Morning, Carol," Tom said. "What are you doing here?" Carol asked, her heart sinking. "I know I shouldn't be, but I needed to see you one last time." Carol glanced over her shoulder, anxiety gripping her. "Tom, you can't be here, Joe's just outside." "I'll be quick. I just need to say goodbye properly," Tom insisted. "We've already said goodbye," Carol replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know," he said, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "But I couldn't leave it like that. You changed my life, Carol. You reminded me that I can feel again." His words pierced her heart. "Tom, this isn't fair, to me, to you, or to Joe. We can't keep doing this." Tom nodded, pain etched on his face. I know, I just needed you to know how much you meant to me. As she watched him walk away, Carol felt a lump in her throat. Each step he took created a growing distance between them. Just as she turned to go back inside, she froze again. Joe was standing by the barn, his eyes locked on the scene and hurt evident in his gaze. "What were you doing?" Joe asked, his voice low but firm. Carol hesitated, then spoke with honesty. "I came to say goodbye." Joe's jaw tightened. "Goodbye, that's all?" "Yes," she said earnestly. "He knows it's over, I've made that clear." Joe studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he nodded slowly. "I believe you." Relief washed over her, but so did the shadow of the hurt in Joe's eyes. "I'm sorry, Joe," she murmured. "I think we both have a lot to be sorry for," he replied, his shoulders relaxing just a bit. "But if we're going to move forward, we need to let the past go." From that day on, Carol and Joe poured their hearts into rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy. Old wounds had a way of reopening unexpectedly. Still, their commitment to each other and their marriage grew stronger. Joe began taking time off the farm to spend with Carol, and together they explored the countryside, visiting small towns they had never seen before. In turn, Carol supported Joe by joining him in the fields or surprising him with a hot lunch. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Joe reached over and took Carol's hand. "You know, through all the mistakes we've made, we've come out stronger," he said. Carol smiled. "I think so too." Months passed, and life on the farm found its rhythm again. But something had changed, deeper, more meaningful. They started hosting weekly dinners filled with laughter and warmth for their kids and grandkids. Carol rediscovered her love for painting, transforming a spare room into a small studio, where she often lost herself in vibrant landscapes inspired by the farm. One evening, while sitting by the fire after dinner, Joe turned to Carol. "You know, I never thought we'd find our way back to this, but I'm glad we did." Carol leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. "Me too." Their journey hadn't been easy. It was messy, painful, and full of unexpected twists, yet it led them back to what mattered most. Amidst their healing, Carol planted a new rose bush in the garden, a vibrant symbol of resilience, growth, and the beauty that could bloom even through life's most difficult seasons.